What's up, everybody? It says we're live. Now, we're doing something a little different here. If you notice there's a little clumsiness in this transition, it's because normally we do live videos on Facebook, on During the Break and of, by, and for the People's Facebook page. But today we're trying something a little different. We're going on YouTube. Yes, as us old people call stuff, we don't call it Facebook. It's the Facebook, it's the TikTok, and it's the YouTube. So we're going to give it a shot. Let me tell you who I am. My name is Clint Powell. I host a number of podcasts. You can find them at thenugapodcast.com. I have 14 podcasts with one click, from crime to health to history to the Constitution and politics, and business. I do one with veterans as well. So Nuga Podcast at podcastisplural.com. This conversation, though, and I want to make sure I do a good setup since a lot of you may see us for the first time. This setup, and let me go make sure I'm being heard okay over here since it is the first time. Here we go. Yeah, yep. We sound actually pretty good. I'm pretty surprised. So far, so good, Eric Buchanan, my guest down here about to come up. But this podcast is Celebrate America 250, 250. We're getting ready to celebrate our 250th year in America. So we're doing a history podcast. That's a spinoff of, by, and for the people. You can find all of those conversations at headlinesandopinions.com. We do that. We're me, Eric Buchanan. You'll learn more about Eric in just a minute. Other guests, we talk about headlines, politics, and opinions. We give each other pushback. We do it in a civil manner. We disagree a little bit. We try to get people who are either a little more red or a little more blue on with us. That spinoff has done a constitutional podcast. You can find it Buchanan Disability. Eric Buchanan has been walking us line by line through the Constitution. However, today we're about, Eric, I don't know how many we're in on this one. I have to look, but we're a good ways into these special editions. We're going back in time, headlines from history. And we're just revisiting these important moments as America was starting to become who we are. We're figuring out this whole freedom thing. And Eric Buchanan is my constitutional guy. He's an attorney. And I'm going to let him come up and tell everybody who he is and what he does. And then, Eric, we will make podcast magic. And if this thing works pretty good, we'll try to do YouTube more often, because this is going a lot smoother than I thought. Eric, you about ready? Here we go. Eric Buchanan in 3, 2, 1. How you doing today, buddy? Oh, and Eric, your mic's on. There we go. There you go. How you doing now?
Hey, Clint, how are you? Good to see you.
Man, I'm good, buddy. I'm good. So new platform here. We're gonna see how this works.
Yeah, this should be fun. So let me give everybody one quick tease. We're going to
Please.
talk about the beginning of the Continental Army when it became a professional force. It's when George Washington arrived in the Boston area on July 3rd, 1775, 250 years ago today. 1 year and 1 day before we became a nation, we actually got an army organized, and we're going to keep working our way through this. If people haven't heard this before, we're working our way through American history 250 years ago, what was happening right now. And Clint, we have done 13 episodes so far.
I was counting them right now. Glad you said that.
Yeah, if you go on to something like Apple Podcasts, you can find it. It's the name of it is, Clint, make sure we say it right. It is Celebrate America 250 Podcast.
And real quick, let me restate that. The website's in the show notes down here, but Celebrate America Podcast 250. You can go there and find them all too. All right, Eric.
All right, so
who the hell are you, man?
Yeah, let me do a quick who am I and a quick commercial before we get into the fun of talking about George Washington showing up to start professionalizing our army. So hi, everybody. My name is Eric Buchanan. I'm a disability insurance attorney in Chattanooga, Tennessee. My law firm, the sponsor of this podcast, has been helping people now for 22 years. We just had our firm's anniversary on July 1st, our 22nd anniversary, helping people who've been denied long-term disability or individual disability insurance benefits. If an insurance company is supposed to pay someone a certain amount of money each month because that person can't work anymore because they have a mental problem or a physical problem, and the insurance company is not paying, we help people like that. We help people that the insurance company is trying to not pay them the money they deserve, the money that they have earned, the money that they paid into to get under that policy. We help even if the law falls under ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, and usually that happens if a person gets their insurance at work. We help people all over the United States. We currently have cases in 44 different states. We work with local attorneys in the states where we are not licensed, or we work under the local rules so that we get admitted pro hac vice. We're in the states where we need to do that. A lot of the ERISA cases end up in federal court. We also have regularly handled cases in state court, even in other states. So for long-term disability or individual disability insurance benefits under ERISA or not, we also help with life insurance, long-term care policies, and large health insurance claims. Whether ERISA applies or not, we have 6 attorneys. We work all over the United States. Look us up on the World Wide Web at BuchananDisability.com, where you can also find our Constitution podcast.
That's right.
Clint, just so people know who we are a little bit, I have been studying American history since I was a little kid. I remember telling my grandmother and my great-grandmother that my favorite war was the American Revolution. When I was just learning how to read, they gave me some of those Time Life history books and some of those other books about American history, and I literally learned how to read on those kind of history books at times. I have been fascinated by this. I also love American political history and our constitutional history. I went to the Virginia Military Institute, and then I went into the Navy and flew P-3s in the Navy around the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s. And after I got out of the Navy, I went to law school at W&L. I paid a special attention to constitutional law, was my constitutional law professor's research assistant. Along the way, I started playing rugby. When I came back to Chattanooga, you and I met playing rugby way back in the late 1900s, maybe the year 2000 or so is when we first met. I also grew up around here. I was an Eagle Scout, and I have just always loved American history. And we're going to talk today, Clint.
All right, let's roll, man. Let's get to it. I'm all in.
A 6'5" hero, the man who eventually would go on to be the father of our country, walking in, or riding his horse in at first, getting off his horse in Cambridge, Massachusetts on July 3rd, and beginning to take command of an army that would eventually win our independence from the largest empire and the most powerful empire on earth at the time. Okay. All right, so to recap a little bit, we covered in a previous episode a few back. In June, the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia had decided that it was time to take these volunteers who were showing up around Boston to fight the British and turn them into some kind of an official force. And on June 14th, 1775, the Continental Congress, the founding fathers who went to Philadelphia in 1775, voted to declare that the troops gathered around Boston made up a Continental Army, and that troops from other states, including southern states, would go up to join them. And some of those troops were enlisted directly to become members of the Army and not local militias. Okay. Now, what had happened up in Boston was, if you recall from a few episodes ago, or if you haven't been listening to us, if you know from American history, the British tried to seize the weapons some local Americans were keeping out in their town of Concord, Massachusetts, that they were storing in case that fighting ever got started. Well, that started the fighting. The British ended up shooting on the Americans on the green at Lexington on the way to Concord. And then in Concord, they started shooting at each other. In Concord, for the first time, an American officer ordered his men to fire on the British. And the Americans then chased the British all the way back to Boston, killed a bunch of them, and pretty good day for the Americans, pretty bad.
Yeah, as you called it, the bloody march out, basically, the bloody march out back.
It was a pretty bad day.
Yeah.
The American local farmers, local merchants, local small businessmen, and a few famous politicians and famous leaders like John Adams and Sam Adams and John Hancock and Dr. Joseph Warren, all these guys started showing up, and they started helping to lead these militia that started showing up. And American farmers showed up by the dozens and later the hundreds, and they showed up as companies. They showed up, and sometimes even in larger units called battalions and regiments. And so by June, there were about 12,000 to 15,000 Americans around Boston. The British thought they were going to occupy some highland near the town of Charleston at a place called Bunker Hill and Breeds Hill. And
I've heard that. We did a podcast on
and
that,
in a recent podcast, we talked about that the British tried to knock the Americans off of the top of Breeds Hill, and the Americans fought back and held out for 3 charges until they ran out of ammunition.
I will say this, the two things I've learned about, well, I've learned a lot, but Paul Revere's ride was not near what I thought it was. It was actually a lot more intriguing, and it really wasn't Bunker Hill. It was more Breeds Hill. So I don't know how Bunker Hill, captured all the glory from that thing or the headlines, but it was really mostly about Breeds Hill. But yeah.
So after the Battle of Bunker Hill is what people call it historically, but actually it should be called Breeds Hill. The Americans pulled back a little bit, but the British still just didn't have enough troops to push the Americans farther back. And so the Americans were dug in basically from a place called Dorchester Heights, south of Boston, all the way around to Cambridge, which was west of Boston. And we still had some troops going up toward Charlestown. And then the British had some troops in Charlestown on Breeds and Bunker Hill, and then they had a lot of troops in the city.
Mm-hmm.
The Americans, after the Battle of Bunker Hill, still had somewhere, historians estimated, between 11 and 16,000 men. The number probably was closer to 14,000. And the British at that point had maybe 6,000 troops. They had a little more than 6,000 when that battle started. They lost a few, but reinforcements for the British kept showing up. And so on June 18th, when that battle happened, the Americans had retreated a little bit, but they still hold most of the ground. The British hold two key spots, downtown Boston, and they hold the Charlestown and the hills above Charlestown, Bunker and Breed's Hill. But it's kind of a stalemate. What the Americans can do is move around anywhere on the land that they want to. And anytime the British try to go out and get supplies, anytime they try to get some cows, they try to get some hay for their horses, even in the little islands off the coast of Boston, if the British ever try to do anything like that, the Americans go out and meet them. The Americans chase them back, and the British are stuck in the city. On the other hand, the British have their Navy, and they can get in and out of Boston and the port of Boston and keep resupplying the British. And so the British are starting to build up their troops. After Bunker Hill, they have about 6,000. By the middle of July, they're going to have about 10,000 troops. So it's getting close to being about the same as what the Americans have, but the British are still stuck in the city.
Right.
Well, remember on June 15th, George Washington had been appointed commander-in-chief. But back
by the way, I'm glad you threw the remember for the new listeners we have. Like, I'm going to remember. Yes. Oh, of course, Erica. Why would I not remember that?
But also remember this. Philadelphia does not have a train to Boston in 1775. There is no airplane. There's no roads that are paved. Right. And so it takes a while for George Washington to get his gear together, gather up some of the other troops that are going with him, some of these riflemen from Pennsylvania and Maryland who are volunteers, and a few from Virginia that are starting to show up. But taking his stagecoach and his horse, and he heads up to Boston. And it takes him 2 weeks or so to get there. And he arrives in the Boston suburb of Cambridge on July 3rd, 1775. July 3rd, 1775, 250 years ago today, as we're recording this, George Washington rode into Cambridge in the suburb of Massachusetts on his horse and officially got off his horse at 12 noon and reported in to the headquarters of the Continental Army that they didn't really know yet that they were officially the Continental Army. Those orders were just coming up from Congress. And he presented his orders to a guy named Artemus Ward. Artemus Ward had been the highest ranking officer who was there. He would eventually, over the next few days, receive his commission as a major general in the Continental Army. So he's still one of the leaders, but the new commander-in-chief is this Virginian, George Washington. We covered it in the previous podcast, but I'll mention this real quick. One of the reasons why George Washington was picked is because the Continental Congress, the founding fathers, looked at this situation and said, okay, we got all these guys from Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut and a few other places around New England, around Boston. There's hardly anybody there from New York. There's nobody there from any of the other states. We want to make this a truly American army to represent all the colonies. And so we pick a Virginian, George Washington, to go up and take command of the army. So he comes in on 250 years ago today, July 3rd, 1775. Now, at this point, the American army, if you could even call it an army at the time, is a mess. And one reason it's a mess is because all these individual units were mostly local militias. These small towns around Massachusetts and Connecticut, some towns might have 50 men join and be a company. Some bigger cities might have 150 men and call it a company.
When we had talked even about the training and when it became uniform and all that too, you know, they were the training and how it all evolved.
So there was
got there yet.
Right. At this point, there is no uniform training. Yeah. There were different, each unit had its own standards. Some units had officers appointed by the local colonial government. Some units had the town appoint the officers. A lot of units elected their own officers. And so you had officers with different levels of experience. Some were well respected by the men. Some were appointed over them that they didn't really like. So George Washington gets there, and one of the first things he does is he starts to organize this into a real army. One of the first things he does is he designates that this is something called the New England Army, and he divides it into 3 divisions, which include 6 brigades, or a total of 38 regiments. And just to very quickly capture that for people who haven't heard this before, a company at that time was around 80 to 120 men. If you have 3 or 4 companies, that makes up a battalion. So you have 300 or 400 men in a battalion, maybe a little less depending on what's going on. 3 or 4 battalions makes up a regiment. And a regiment in a real European army at this point is kind of the key unit that you can order around on the battlefield. You order one regiment at a time to do stuff, or you might order 3 or 4 regiments to work together. But
Right. And in conjunction with each other.
You basically give orders to the commanding officers of regiments. The commanding officers of regiments are colonels. So like a captain commands a company, a major or a lieutenant colonel commands a battalion, a colonel commands a regiment. A brigade is commanded by a brigadier general, 1 star, and a division is normally commanded by a 2-star general. So now we have 3 divisions made up of 6 brigades and 38 regiments. Now, it's not just putting it on paper that we're going to start organizing that kind of stuff. One of the first things that General Washington did in addition to that is he went around and started looking at the camps and how these guys were organized. And he realized, based on his experience in the French and Indian War and some of the training he'd had back in the day, that the American colonial militia did not know what the hell they were doing, even in simple things like setting their camp up. Things like not having a slit trench to go to the latrine far enough away from where you're cooking and eating your food. There were men going right outside.
That's going to lead to problems.
So, and this is before we had germ theory. We didn't know germs that would make people sick, but it was common knowledge by this point that in the military, people would often get sick when they were all camped together. And one of the things that caused that was having a lack of sanitation. And so the idea that you would go downhill and downwind and away from your water supply and away from your keeping food, and that's where you put a latrine. Very few of these militia units had done that. So George Washington, one of the first things he starts doing is enforcing the idea of more sanitation, building these camps in a way so the latrine's over here, the food's over here, and the men are not too close to the latrine. Right. He also realizes that these are just a bunch of local guys with no discipline. So he puts out a rule: no drunkenness and no gambling. He doesn't stop drinking altogether, but he says no drunkenness and no gambling. So you can be punished for drunkenness and gambling. The other big thing that he does, Clint, have you ever seen the movie Miracle on Ice?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's been a long time, but yeah.
And so you remember it's the story of the American hockey team in 1980 that beat the Russians and then turned out.
Right. Yeah. It was very underdog.
Yeah. And what was the guy's name that was the Disney actor who is the guy in charge, who was the who played the coach? Let's look that up real quick.
I don't know. Yeah, you're going to have do your own movie references on this one. I'm not a movie reference guy when it goes back that far. Plus, it's not a silly, stupid movie, which that's where all my quotes come from.
So it was Herb Brooks was his name in real life.
Yeah.
And the actor.
You're doing for the actor for that?
It was Kurt Russell. Why I cannot remember?
Oh my God!
Off the top of my head, it's Kurt Russell.
Okay.
So there's a scene in the movie where Kurt Russell does what Herb Brooks did originally. When he brings together all these players, the American hockey team was made up of college players. The Russians had guys that were basically professionals. But back in the 1980 Olympic time period, and it was later on that the Olympics allowed professionals to start playing. And so while the Russians and the East Germans typically had amateurs, but they lived in state housing and they got paid a salary to go be like maybe in the military, but all they did for their job was constantly trained to do this. The Americans had to use a bunch of college kids. And there's a scene in the movie where he's first bringing together all these really good college kids. He's picked his team. They're all a bunch of all-stars. And he asked one of the kids, "What team do you play for?" And he says, "I play for Harvard, sir." And he goes, "Okay." Everybody do a suicide where they had to skate down halfway back, all the way down back, do it real fast. They get done, and he asks the next guy, "What team do you play for?" And the guy says, "I play for Minnesota, sir." And he, without saying another word, he tells them to go do another suicide. And he keeps doing that. And every time they name the school that they play for, he makes them do another suicide until one of the kids finally says, "I play for the United States of America." He finally figures out what the coach was asking. He wants them to say, "I play for the United States." And that's when Herb Brooks, played by Kurt Russell, says, "Okay, you guys can go take a shower." George Washington did the same thing starting in July of 1775. He went around to all these individual units and basically said, "Okay, where are you men from?" And they would say, "We're from the town of Worcester, Massachusetts," or whatever. Mm-hmm. And he would say, "Well, who do you fight for?" And they would say, "Massachusetts." And he would say, "You are the 3rd company of the 2nd Regiment of the Massachusetts Volunteers of the Continental Army." and he started teaching everyone that they now needed to identify by their unit assigned within the Continental Army, and that they were members of the Continental Army representing all 13 colonies, not their individual town and colony.
Yeah, that's creating unity. That's the bond. That's the we are a part of something bigger than us, and it's even bigger than the colony we come from.
And so this basically became the first real national identity and professionalization of the American Army. So they didn't solve all the problems. George Washington didn't do a great job yet of drilling them to properly fight standing up the way the Europeans did.
Right.
But he at least got them to basically say, I am an American soldier. I am fighting for the Continental Army. They didn't have the name United States yet. We're still a year away from the Declaration of Independence. Yeah. But at this point, we now have an organization of an army that George Washington brings to the table and starts establishing what becomes the Continental Army that's going to fight all the way up till 1783 against the largest empire in the world, and we're going to succeed over the next few years. But this is when it all starts. Now, over the next month or so, the British keep getting reinforcements. The Americans have some desertions, and we get to the point where the British have about 10,000 men and the Americans have about 10,000 men. So one of the things, the last little piece I want to talk about is George Washington's challenge over the first few weeks is he's got to keep the British worried that the Americans have enough men and that they can stop the British if they try to go anywhere on land and the British stay bottled up in the city. Some of the American generals suggest that they attack Boston and chase the British out. And as George Washington's starting the planning for that, he asked a question that the American generals hadn't asked each other. How much ammunition do we have? How much gunpowder do we have? And at the end of the Battle of Bunker Hill, the local troops on the scene, one of the reasons they lost after 3 attacks by the British is they'd run out of ammunition. Well, George Washington starts getting the supply guys together and start figuring out the supplies for this new Continental Army. And they realize there's only enough gunpowder for 9 shots per soldier.
Oh, wow.
9 shots per soldier, and they're going to be done. So George Washington, when he puts this together, tells his supply officers, don't even tell anybody else. He writes letters back to the Continental Congress and asks for them to go get the other states, the other colonies at this point still, to start raising money and bringing some gunpowder in. He even sends some people to the Caribbean to try to go to some French islands to buy some gunpowder and bring it back. But in the meantime, he cancels any thought of attacking Boston and chasing the British off. And at this point, he's just worried about maintaining discipline and hoping the British don't find out that his men only have 9 rounds per person worth of gunpowder. And they also are just barely learning how to be soldiers at this point. And that's what's going on in America in early July 1775.
What's the next big thing on the history list we're going to be talking about here? The next headline through history that we're going to be talking about.
So as soon as we can find time for you and me to get together next week for probably a little bit longer podcast, but not too much longer, we're going to talk about the Olive Branch petition. So back in Philadelphia, the founding fathers are debating with each other over where's this going? Is this a war for independence? Is this a war that we can reach a deal with the British government to treat us better? And the founding fathers that would like to establish peace and stay part of the British Empire, that we don't want to go for outright independence and pure and 100% rebellion, they pushed for something called the Olive Branch petition, which is they're going to vote on whether to send a letter to the king offering to make a deal and we'll stop fighting and let's reach some terms. And we're going to go into detail about that someday next week.
All right, cool. Listen, before we leave, because it's a new venue, I do want to let people know some of the topics we've talked about. So this will be just me driving for a second. If you go to Celebrate America Podcast 250, you will hear us talk about the Ben Franklin, the Privy Council, the Boston Port Act of 1774, the Committees of Correspondence, the First Continental Congress, the Cohesive Acts, March 23rd. Oh, Patrick Henry, the Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech. And I'm going to the next page because I want to make sure people understand that there's things that they've actually heard about, but may have forgotten. And again, they just may not know all of the details. And you can find all those on the podcast website. And we have the Paul Revere, his wild ride. We had the battles of Lexington and Concord. Plus, we had 3 on those. Plus, that includes the Bloody March back. And then we just did the most recent one we did is the one you referred to earlier, the Battle of Bunker Hill. And there's a few strung along in there, but there's a lot of history and headlines in that if you go check it out. And then we'll try to start doing it more. Just so you know, Eric, we'll do it in real time. We had about as many views tonight on YouTube as we normally have on Facebook. So we can do maps here. We can always do maps on Facebook, just so anybody knows. If you're like, well, I want to go see all their content, we have much, much more at the Of, By, and For the People page. And we also have the Celebrate America page too on Facebook. But there we go, man. It wasn't a bad first run on YouTube.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to a little bit more this summer. There's going to be kind of a slowdown after the Olive Branch petition. Not much happens because George Washington wants to preserve his ammunition, and so stuff gets really going again later in September and October, and we'll have some more conversations about that too. So if you're interested in this and you want to follow us, go ahead and do that. Well, there'll be an episode or two still this summer, and then it's going to get really exciting in fall when 250 years ago in the fall of 1775 we invade Canada.
Hell yeah, why not?
And do some other stuff. So it's going to be fun.
We weren't trying to make them the 51st state, were we?
We were making them the 14th state, the 14th colony.
I cannot wait. All right, man. With that being said, let's get out of here. I'll see you, buddy.
All right, Clint. Good job. Talk to you later.
Everybody.
All right, bye.